Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me in my presentation today. My name is Tara Howes, and I'll be discussing gender, indigeneity, and trust in the social license. I do want to take a moment to recognize that I did research gender as a result of this project. However, I was constrained to the male and female binary, and I do reject this binary concept. Also, there is no such thing as one Indigenous group, and my research is not meant to, nor should it be interpreted as essentializing or homogenizing Indigenous peoples in Canada or the world. I also need to note that I am a settler, and this is a concept that I have no problems identifying with. But what it means is that my ideas of place and time and geography or boundaries differ from many ontologies of Indigenous nations. It's really important that we talk about this because the colonial mindset is well embedded within resource extraction and by extension the social license. And we need to start acknowledging and discussing how these interplay with both resource extraction as a project, but also resource extractivism as a process. So to dive in, a quick review about social license. Social license is not a legislated license. You don't walk into a government building and apply for it. It's tacit and informal, and it's an agreement by the community or the proximate communities to the project. There are four main levels of a social license, and my research was focused on that first one, that withheld or withdrawn piece. It's the one that you can most easily see as it manifests in things like conflicts of blockades or even violence. There are actually 25 years worth of research on this concept, although most of it has been contained in the mining industry. Susan Joyce and Ian Thompson were the first known pioneers to formalize this concept, and they actually linked it to the historical and political conflicts that emerged from Latin American mining project conflicts. However, despite all of these years of research, there is still a number of gaps. The first one is that there is a recognition that trust is the utmost importance in securing a social license, yet nobody has actually explored what trust means. Secondly, there's only two pieces of research that consider what gender means in the social license, and absolutely none, despite its origins, that use an explicit Indigenous framework or lens. The other thing to consider is that, likely a result of the heavy industry influence on the research, most of the research views the social license as an outcome to a strategy, like a corporate responsibility strategy, versus a process of a relationship development. It does differ from something like an impacts and benefits agreement, although that could be an indicator, but not always, of a social license. So my research really started to explore how gender and indigeneity are essentially erased from a project proponent's engagement strategy. I looked at three different projects across the large hydro, mineral mining, and forestry industries. A research question there, how do settler colonial studies and intersectionality explain trust, really just means I had the opportunity to hold space to understand the historical, political, traditional knowledges that exist, as well as the ability to intersect different identity factors for both women and Indigenous people into this space. And so why should we care about gender and indigeneity in the resource extraction space? Well, first off, these projects are occurring on Indigenous lands, and in British Columbia, a lot of that land is unceded territories. We know that there are constitutionally protected rights for Indigenous peoples in Canada, such as the right to hunt and fish. And yet when a project comes in, there's often contamination of soil and water, and these are resulting in significantly higher health issues, such as increased infertility rates. There's also this trend in Canada where a project proponent is choosing to go through the court system to actually prove or disprove the adequacy of their consultation with Indigenous peoples. This means that the taxpayers are actually footing the bill for these court processes. We also know when it comes to the impacts that there are a disproportionate distribution of these impacts. So typically, the economic impact is the big positive. Jobs and money flow into a community. And yet, we know that most of the employment is actually going to men, often men that are outside the community. And when women are hired, they're typically hired at lower wages in administrative positions. And so we have these wage gaps that are also emerging. We know that women, when they are hired, are involved in a highly masculinized workplace, which results in high levels of sexual harassment and blatant sexism. And when we intersect indigeneity into this process, We also know that there's excessive rates of racism that people will experience. When we, again, look at the numbers for employment, so the mining industry, for example, has been working at this issue for decades, and yet they still only have 15% of women represented. And in Fort St. John, where Site C is located, they actually have an experience of twice the national wage gap average. So once again, just pointing to how men are benefiting from these jobs and women are not necessarily being able to take advantage of the positive impacts of a project. And yet the negative impacts, specifically gender-based violence and sexual violence, are really being felt by women in the community. Often a result of transient men coming into a community for a short time will have an increase of substance abuse that turns into violence against women. And because these are occurring in remote areas, there's already less services and less funding that exists to deal with it. And lastly, we know that the decision-making process, women and Indigenous people are just simply not there. There are these structures in place that completely erase them from that opportunity and that process. So when we look again at workplace and organization, there may be a diversity hire that occurs. They're sitting at the boardroom. We call that the mix and stir approach, where we get to put them there and then tick the box that they've been included, and yet we're not actually dealing with the structures that are preventing people from participating or applying in the first place. And then when it comes to land use differences, we know that there's a different mindset between settler colonial land use and Indigenous land use. Zoe Todd is a Métis scholar, and she talks about how the fossil fuel industry literally forces her to consume her ancient kin. And that is just a mindset, once again, that we have to keep space for and recognize when we're talking about a social license in a community. And now moving into specific commonalities that I saw across the 3 projects that I looked at, 6 key themes came up. The first is that there was a shared history amongst each of the project communities. Each of the communities have experienced a negative with industrial resource extraction project in the past. They all experienced catastrophic environmental harms as a result of negligence from the proponent. There was aggressive and violent tactics used, and poor consultation efforts occurred. However, they also had this collective activism that brought them together, and they were able to at least come together as a shared community and fight the project. And this really speaks to the shared community values that each of the projects saw. They all have very strong values focused on ecological and communal living, plus this reliance on subsistence living. When it looks specifically at the engagement process about gender, it was just non-existent. And I mean, it was not spoken about, discussed at all about how the project may impact women specifically in the community. They were erased from that process. And then there were a number of questions related to transparency. Each of the communities didn't have any faith that the environmental process was actually going to look out for them. And there was major concerns about lobbying and donation rules and veils of secrecy that related to how the decision-making process was actually occurring. When it comes to resource management, we have to recognize that land and title are a huge thing. And it really comes down to who owns the land and resources on it, who has access to it, and who is actually managing it. And I bring this up just to once again ensure that we have these conversations and start talking about it. And then we look at the general consultation process. Each of the processes follow the legislated process as laid out. However, the failure of this is that it wasn't set up to develop long-term relationships. And you can really see this once again when it comes to social license, that the mandated requirements are just simply not enough. A project proponent will come in with excessive money and a lot of information, do a standard open house, use a lot of technical language, and just expect the community to accept and trust that information that is put forward. So the importance of understanding what trust is becomes really, really explicit. If we're wanting a community to trust the information, we have to figure out what it is. And so the defined accepted definition of trust is the willingness to be vulnerable. And this concept is something I will come back and question. However, essentially, it's about a relationship between the parties, and it's all based on the interactions and past experiences. So if you have a number of positive interactions, you'll typically have a greater likelihood of developing trust. We know that trust can occur at the interpersonal, at the micro level, and also at the institutional level, at the macro level. And this institutional piece can really facilitate or erode that trust that may exist interpersonally. When there is any type of threat or coercion in place, such as an expropriation of land, we can't actually call that trust. That is something else, and we cannot equate coercion with trust. And when we look at the types of trust on how it's developed, there's two kinds, the calculus-based and relational-based. So calculus-based can really be seen in that government or project proponent coming in and saying, I would like to remove your resource and in exchange give you jobs and money into your community. And it's whether then the community actually trusts that process to occur safely and to the level that they're willing to be vulnerable to it. In exchange, relational trust is really about that long-term process of developing positive experiences between them. And this relational trust has been identified as a key component for developing trust, particularly between settler people and Indigenous populations. And so when we're talking about a social license, we have to start asking, what is the proponent actually asking when they're seeking a social license from a community? And how does that change when we figure out who is accepting that risk and is it a vulnerable or disadvantaged population? And when we root that trust and vulnerability, the current social license research and the government processes that exist are creating the onus on an already marginalized population to willingly accept activities that they know will expose them to well-documented harms. And so this theory started to emerge. Once again, this is emerging theory, not a proven theory, about continuities, power imbalances, and the reduced public empowerment. So continuities refer to these structures and processes that are in place that continue to maintain an oppression of a group or an individual. So for when we look at Indigenous people, they are typically referred to as stakeholders in a lot of this discourse, whether we're talking from the corporate or government perspective or the social license research. And what this does is it continues the assimilation process that the colonial project started. By calling an Indigenous nation, which is an independent nation, by downgrading that status to a stakeholder, we're saying that they are at the same level as a trail society or a rod and gun club, which is not the case since they have constitutionally protected rights that must be honored. We also know that for women, there's a systemic and systematic devaluation of women that's built right into the assessment system, since all we do is measure environment versus economic output. So instead of asking how many jobs are going to be created, an alternative way to look at this is to ask what the acceptable rate of violence against women is for a project that you are willing to accept. So all of these lead to a maintenance of power imbalances. We know that coercion is not consent, and that the balance of power is largely in favor of the proponent, since they have huge dollars available to them, staff and experts, and ready access to cabinet ministers to lobby and discuss. And yet when they come into a community, land defenders and neighbors must get together really quickly, often while they're working full time, without any of these available resources available to them. And so what this can do is lead to these overall feelings of inevitability and inability to have any change in the process. And this inevitability piece is a reflection of low institutional trust. And unfortunately, in each of these projects that I looked at, low institutional trust was validated, since the government would often form injunctions to the court systems or issue what's called the slap suit, which is a horrifying example of erosion of democracy. And so you're forcing the public to then just be basic objects in this process instead of actually active participants. And so what this has led me to conclude is that it is only through positive and inclusive interactions that focus on relationship development and providing power and agency to the most vulnerable will a social license ever truly be developed. Because without redistributing this power, without giving communities the same length of time for understanding a project and its impacts, or access to government staff, or money to conduct independent studies, and of course, listening to those traditionally underrepresented voices, then the process and the social license by extension will simply continue to exploit existing vulnerabilities. And so with that, I really look forward to our conversation. Thank you so much for listening to this today.